so we'll go ahead and get started. Two quick things before we begin here. Number one, I've had this happen the last 2 times I've been on Zoom, whether it's been at the office or here at my house, and I think it's with this computer, but about every minute I have a 2-second delay with my internet connection, so I will try to account for that if I'm speaking, which hopefully won't be too much tonight. Second thing, I apologize, but don't really apologize. Those of you who judge your priest having a beer while he leads a book study, it's the day to have a beer.
What else we've got?
Yeah, I was going to say, Joe already showed me his beverage. I would imagine there's probably some other.
Well, since we're not reading about prohibition, we'll let you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good thing this is not a book on prohibition. Yeah, we'll save that for the book that you're reading there. So I'll open us with a short prayer and then we'll begin. Let us pray. Gracious God, the God who calls us to a knowledge of seeing you present in all people, grant that we may constantly strive to work towards seeing your light and love in all people, especially those who do not have a voice, who do not have the power to speak up for themselves, and who often find themselves oppressed at the hands of those who are in power. May we stand up and be able to witness to each other and to the world the power of your love that is found in each of us, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So tonight as last week, I gave you a reprieve if you had not read the book. Tonight, now we're going to be in the book. So if you have not started the book, then you can still follow along. You just won't have as much of a referent. So I'm just going to kind of throw a couple of thoughts. And really, this book study from my end is I'm just going to start the conversation and then we'll see where it goes. Because really, again, my goals in this are to have us feeling free to talk about our own experiences of racism, injustice, and also talking about the experiences that we have had with others. And we got off to a good start with that last week. And tonight, in the context of the book, which is the introduction and chapters 1 and 2, were what we were asked to cover for tonight. So a couple of things come to mind. Well, 3. The first one's more personal. There's a lot of places and people even that I recognize from this book. I first read it while I still lived in Mobile and picked up very quickly that Lower Alabama, as we called it, is very prevalent in this book. I want to be very clear, though, that all of what he describes going on in Lower Alabama or in Gadsden or in Georgia, wherever he talks about, is applicable here. And is applicable to so many other places. In fact, a couple of y'all shared about incidences from places like Massachusetts and Chicago and places that have their own problems with these very same things, just maybe with a little different tinge to them. So it's framed in a context, but I say the obvious to remind us that it is not confined to the state of Alabama. As much as I can tell you about things I heard and saw in Mobile, I can tell you about things I heard and saw in Cleveland, Mississippi. Boy, I can tell you some things there. And I can tell you some things growing up in Chattanooga. I can tell you some things from Dallas, from here in Oak Ridge, from all these places where I've lived. So I want to make sure we don't just pigeonhole Lower Alabama here. I told you last week that my own background with being a child of law enforcement is that often my first reaction when I read stories is particularly what's talking about prison guards. I know people who work in prison. It's an awful job. I would never wish it on anybody. And so I always start with some sympathy for prison guards and for police. And I share that with you. It's important because I get very frustrated with people who just want to completely denigrate police, corrections officers, and almost the same mindset that racism imbues with people of black or brown or skin that's not white. The same attitude often is reflected back at police and correction officers. So I think just that little nugget to remind ourselves that as we talk about this, that we truly are here to see the light of God in all people as we have these conversations. But then clearly in these chapters, the story that resonated with me the most among many was the story of him getting stopped. Well, not really stopped because he was already pulled over, but pulled over essentially by the police in front of his apartment in Midtown Atlanta. And I've had an incident where I was pulled over. I've been pulled over multiple times. We won't go into that, but for moving violations. But I've had an incident where I was pulled over and it was a more contentious encounter with police. And I guess my first question tonight is, I asked the question last week, what has been your experience law enforcement? I might ask a little deeper question. What has been your experience or experience of someone you know who has had more than just a casual encounter with the police or someone in law enforcement? And did you feel intimidated? Did you feel threatened? Did you just feel a sense of guilt or being overwhelmed? What was the experience that you had in that? And then we can talk about the context of the story too that Stevenson shared. But I open the floor with that question and see where it goes. I started with a heavy-hitting question. Apparently, we're all silent here. Well, let's focus on the story. When you read that story of him being pulled over in his Midtown home, what were the thoughts going through your mind? How did you react to that story?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Deb.
Well, my first thought was my familiarity with Atlanta, and because I lived there mid-70s in Chamblee, and that there was just a horrible crime situation. And yes, that would be my thought, was perhaps understanding why the guy was pulled over. However, what transpired after he pulled over and, being threatened like that and so forth, that kind of got me to thinking about the George Floyd and other related incidents where people get killed no matter what they do. And I've had a long discussion with my oldest brother, who's from an area, North Carolina, the Tidewater area, that is very traditional Southern, and very much the whites and the blacks, very separate sort of tradition there. And they're all poor. But he said, well, why don't these people that get stopped and killed, all they have to do is say, yes, sir, and do what they're told. But that's not the case. And I kind of thought that when I was looking at that particular, or reading that particular episode where he got stopped and he was treated very horribly, right in front of his apartment. And in the book, it mentions that his roommate was inside the apartment, and there were some of his neighbors who actually knew him and were coming out and were making comments about him. Well, he may have, surprise, surprise, or whatever, but it was like the assumption that he was guilty just because he was black, and the police were there. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Well, I'm glad you said that about the assumption of guilt. We have this notion that you're innocent until proven guilty, but that doesn't seem to be the case for a number of these instances when the police pull people aside. It seems like the overwhelming assumption is guilt, and then the person has to prove they're not guilty. I saw something online, a woman, 2 women in a car, black women in a car with babies in the back seat. This is recently pulled over and for 45 minutes grilled, and their babies are screaming in the back seat. And, they had done nothing wrong. They were parked somewhere. And then after the 45 minutes was up, the officer said, oh, well, okay, you're free to go. We thought this car was stolen, even though the woman showed her information. So I bring that up as a more recent example of the kind of thing that happened here in this story. The assumption that these people are guilty And they have to go out of their way to prove that they're innocent.
I'm going to take the cop side on this one for a minute. In the first place, maybe someone called in the fact that there was somebody sitting out in the car. I don't know whether we knew whether someone had called it in, but at least the police called in and found out that they had nothing on this person. And they didn't assume and start beating him up right away, and which we have heard in many cases. So there had been supposedly some robberies in the area, and here was somebody sitting in a car and they didn't know why. And they called it in and found out there was no record of this guy. And eventually they let him go. It was scary, and they could have maybe handled it a lot better. But you have to also look at the side of the police sometimes, in that they are supposed to be protecting the neighborhood.
I think the question you have to ask, Judy, and it's really hard to ask it because there's no way of knowing, is if they would have treated a white man the same way.
Oh, no, they wouldn't have, no.
And I think that's the issue as much as what happened. It's the way it happened. You know, why did they pick him sitting in his car instead of someone else sitting in their car half a block down, listening to the same radio program or whatever it was? Because, if you listen to NPR, they're always talking about driveway moments. He was having a driveway moment while black.
I guess I'm a bit surprised that he'd lived 4 years in Atlanta and recently moved into Virginia Highlands and was not familiar with the neighborhood. And I think what he really had going for him was when he saw the threatening looking cops, he didn't run. And then when he reflected on it, he said, if he'd been 10 years younger, he probably would have run, and then he would have gotten shot. The guy had pulled a gun on him. It was a scary situation. And I'm just surprised that he had managed to make it 4 years in Atlanta without having this happen sooner.
Yeah, that instinct to run, and the story that I mentioned about one of my more intense encounter with the police. I was in high school, and I was on my way to school, and I was flying down one of the main drags of Chattanooga trying to get to school on time. Caught me, and my mom still wonders, what in the world were you doing? To this day, I decided to run. I sped up, and they pulled me over finally when I stopped at my school. And after everything I've read and heard and seen, particularly with the experience of African Americans, I was very fortunate that they didn't have a gun pulled on me when I stopped in the parking lot. But needless to say, it took a lot of calming down on all of us for them not to haul me away. But that instinct to run, I can understand. And I know most of us, for a simple traffic stop, know better than to run. In my case, I was probably going 65 and a 35. So, and when you have a mom who's a judge, and they can tell you, oh, that's reckless driving. Oh, you're going to have your license dinged with your license. The stupid thoughts of a 17-year-old who has been driving for less than a year. But yeah, the instinct to run is there. And when your narrative is, and people want to, a lot of white people like to, challenge this narrative, which I find interesting. It's not for us to challenge or to denigrate. It's the narrative of a lot of folks in the black community is when the police show up, it's not always going to be a positive encounter. And if that's what you've been raised with, your instinct to run becomes greater. I resonate with that immensely.
Yes, for me though, honestly, I don't understand. I can understand a 17-year-old a 20-year-old wanting to run, but an adult, I guess it's flight or fright. But you know, there should be some respect for authority, and I just kind of have a hard time understanding why run. It's going to make things worse. That's just my thought to it.
Hey, I have a story to share. I have never told anybody this, but my family, because it embarrassed me. But, you know, I was working at a school here in town as a teacher's aide, and I usually left that school and went to help out at another one. So, you know, when I got out of school, I was usually in a hurry, which, you know, I'm not a person I've never gotten a speeding ticket before, but one day school had been out, and I don't even think the kids were out yet. And I was going, you know, down the road in front of the school, not right in front, not where there was a crossing or anything, but out of the blue, this unmarked SUV came up behind me, and it was an officer of high status, let me just say. And, you know, he just automatically berated me. I didn't say anything mean. I mean, you know, I do respect police. I've worked for the state park police, but I know there's some policemen that just aren't nice, you know, or I found this out in my instance. And he even, he knew I was upset because, you know, I was stressed out that day. And he even threatened to tell my boss, the principal. He said, I'm going to tell. I mean, it really did upset me, and I could have made a complaint, because later many complaints came out. And I'm not one to beat up on people or anything. You know, I prefer for things to smooth themselves out. But that was an instance where that just wasn't right. You know, that can leave a bad taste in people's mouths. But I respect policemen, but, you know, we have to get both ways, like, you know, y'all were saying. So that was my experience.
Well, and I'm thinking about what Deborah said about respect for the police. If you're in the Black community, and there have been so many instances of people being, from their perspective, abused, then they've got a history in mind of not trusting the police. You know, if the police are after you, they're not going to be fair to you. And I don't know that running would help, but, you know, they have this idea of, oh my God, I got to get away from these people because they are going to be unfair. So they start out with a notion of the police not going to respect them. So I think, you know, their mental frame is going to be different from ours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can tag after that as well, that okay, so here's the situation. You would get up and you get your coffee and you go in and you turn on the Today Show, and the lead story this time is that in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a nana and her daughter and her 3 grandchildren were were sitting in the parking lot, and police approached the car with guns drawn, misunderstood about a stolen car. And those children, you know, our children in Oak Ridge were on the hot asphalt, a grandma, a mom, or, you know, whatever. And then, you know, if you see that week after week, you know, well, then there was an incident here and an incident there and an incident there, it gets to the point where you don't want to see the police approaching your car. And I think there would have been a huge uproar if it had been. I think things would be different also. You know, okay, well, this was a Black family, but, if they pull the little old, blonde-haired, green-eyed Nana out of the car and throw her down and handcuff her, well, that would be insane. That's crazy. But, oh, well, they were, there is a difference. There is a difference. I don't feel a need to run from the police, but nobody that I know in my family has ever sat in a parking lot handcuffed just because they were sitting there. And yet, I think in the Black community, I would be willing to bet that, it's kind of like everybody knows somebody. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's why we need to hear from the Black community.
I think it's interesting hearing all of our different perspectives because, again, really as we share this, just to remind us, ultimately just as Sherry said, our goal is to try to begin at some point to have conversations with people in the African American community who would offer their perspective about things that we may take for granted, like how do you respond to the police? And just like we're listening to each other's stories, I think we'll be in some ways we won't be surprised because I think a lot of us have already sort of guessed where a lot of their experiences have been with police, but might also be surprised to hear some of their other reactions and perceptions would be very different than ours. I want to shift to I started with chapter 2 and going to jump back into chapter 1, which really is the beginning of telling the story of really the main character here in the novel, Walter McMillan. And again, this is where we're placing this in the context of Lower Alabama, but I can see these stories taking place everywhere. But the story of a man who has, Stevenson makes it clear, he's not a perfect angel by the account, not from a criminal perspective, but certainly has one or two moral failings, just like most of us have in some regard, in some way, whether it's a lesser thing or a greater thing. But the whole setup about growing up in a society where the interesting part of the description of Walter McMillan was that he sort of was a rebel in the sense he didn't just work for the paper mill industry or the timber industry. He actually owned his own business, which garnered him a little bit more of acceptance. But to me, it struck me very profoundly how quickly his freedom was in many ways a house of cards that came down through something totally out of his control, except for the fact that, yes, he was having an affair with a married woman who happened to be white. And the judgment that came down upon him, not talking about the legal judgment, but the judgment of the surrounding community. And Stevenson sets that up in the story as, this is not headed in a good direction here. I guess my thoughts out for conversation here is, until really I was an adult, I never really thought about the fact, number one, I never was raised by my parents to look at interracial couples or dating as being anything bad. But I've realized that around me, there were quite a few people who it was a no-no and in some ways was an unforgivable sin for that to take place. And I didn't realize, and I think this is part of these conversations, I guess my naivete that I still have to this day, the fact that growing up in that part of Alabama with the fact that as a Black person, and really as a poor white person, they had their own roles too, but as a Black person, Walter McMillan and all the other African Americans had a very prescribed role. And getting outside of that role was a very dangerous thing. And my question to you is this something that you were aware of when you were growing up, or did you come to a realization of this later in life, that that standard for what the roles of Black people versus white people, and of course women and men have defined roles, especially in the South, but did you grow up with that knowledge? And whenever you discovered that, was that something that, how did you discover, how did that make you feel to figure that out, that you step outside your role, it's not only looked down upon, it can be a very dangerous thing?
I can
What are
speak.
your thoughts? Wherever it was you were raised, and then this group of people. Go ahead.
Well, I was raised in Spokane, Washington, which is the conservative side of Washington State, opposite of Seattle. And when I was in high school, maybe about a sophomore, a young man asked me out. Now, all through high school, if somebody asked me out, I'd always dutifully go to my parents and tell them and ask, can I go? On this one instance, and I was just telling my husband, all of this kind of came back to me as I'm reading the book, that this young man, my mother goes, well, you know, his father is Black and he married a white woman and they're trash. And, you know, I didn't know what to think. My mother had forbidden me to go out with all kinds of people. So he was one in a long line. It's just the reason I didn't get to go out with him was because he was half Black. And he didn't look like it to me. I mean, he was very fair-skinned. The more I looked at his picture, I could, you know, kind of figure out, yeah, that could be kind of towards a Negroid feature. But, you know, I accepted my parents' judgment. But to this day, and neither one is alive, it's like, well, the father was a prominent lawyer, Black lawyer. What is it that this guy had done? And as a sophomore in high school, you know, I wasn't privy to the long line of political shenanigans that went on in Spokane, and I'm sure there were many on both sides. So I didn't know what it was that made the person himself, you know, a suspicious person. I knew that my parents thought the wife as a white woman marrying the Black was just wrong. And, you know, don't you know, if you go out with this person, if you were to get married, you could have a Black baby. I mean, I remember these conversations and being rather startled by the whole thing. And, you know, I've wondered whatever happened to that young man over the years. But yeah, it became an issue.
When I worked out the plants, I was a supervisor, project manager, and I had while I was there, several really good employees who were Black. And there was one lady who, in terms of asking for time off to go do this or that, and she'd say, I have something personal I need to take care of. I have to do this, I have to do that. And she was really a very quiet, somewhat subdued lady, but I never had any difficulties with her. I mean, she had a very good work history and all sorts of stuff like that. Gave her performance reviews and so forth, but she was just a pretty, you know, an okay. Everybody here who's ever managed some people and had to go through, you know, certain processes knows this. But later in life, actually not too long ago, I was at an exhibit that Rose Weaver, who does sort of the history of Scarborough, did. And this lady that I supervised was like a community leader and a very key person in the community. And I never knew that about her. So speaking of roles, however I looked at her, I was completely surprised to see that she really had this near legendary role with working with the people of Scarborough and her community and her things that she did. But it was like, I never asked her about that. I never knew that. I never thought that. It was like Scarborough, like a lot of people growing up in Oak Ridge, it's like you've got a blank section of your head. You don't really know anything about what goes there except you're supposed to avoid that area. I mean, I'm just telling the way it was. It's just, so whatever they say about Oak Ridge in terms of, you know, it doesn't have a lot of traditional feelings of the South, it definitely does. And I always found her history and that Rose did and other things, they're really very educational and really revealing to me about how one-sided a lot of us were who've made our lives in Oak Ridge. So, I mean, just saying that. But this gal, like I said, I was completely gobsmacked. I did not know what she was doing with her time off. I just gave it to her. I mean, but it's kind of like she obviously didn't feel there's any point in telling me, like, you know, we've got this, we've got that going on. That never came up. She took her own time to do that, her own leave, things like that. Anyway, that's just very interesting.
Why were you so surprised?
I think I was surprised. I have a malfunctioning washing machine, which is why I keep muting it, because it makes a lot of noise. I don't want y'all to hear that. I think I was just surprised that I didn't know that about her. I prided myself on being a very good supervisor in terms of if that person had an issue or had a problem. And they actually would assign a lot of employees to me who had problems with other people. Plus, when you work in records management, everybody thinks no matter how bad off that person is, they can surely do records, which was always an issue. For people who did records, we were like the bottom rung of sophistication out at the plants. But this gal was just very good, very centered, very, you know, just a really superb person. And I never really took the time to get to know this whole side of her.
I wasn't attacking you. But
No,
I think
I'm just saying it's
the biggest problem is that whenever you see a black person, you have a different image
right.
than you do for a white person. You make assumptions immediately as you see them.
Yeah.
And that's the big problem over the long term, is how to stop that.
Well, yeah, that's true. It's true. But I think it just shocked me that I didn't know her. You're right. I didn't take the time to get to know that aspect of her, and for her to be such a person that was a key aspect of her whole approach to life and being an Oak Ridger and living in Scarborough and so forth.
What makes you think she wanted to be known
I
by you?
I don't know.
You know, that's one thing that I keep coming back to. I grew up with a Black community, and I say it that way because most of our families of color lived in a somewhat removed community. It's a long story, and I'm not sure how exactly it happened, but they all have Dutch names and they live in Hilburn, except for a few. But it was very hard to know them. There was one girl that she ranked in the top 4 or 5 in our high school class. I mean, she's brilliant. And I would invite her to parties with my parents' reluctant permission. She never came.
Yeah.
I spoke to her again. I hadn't seen her in 50 years. I saw her at our high school reunion. We had a really good talk. But the fact of the matter is that, you know, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you don't quite trust the people you're with, and therefore you don't reveal anything about yourself that might give them a handle on you because you don't want them to know. And it doesn't have to be personal. It could just be, I don't know, they're Lithuanian and I don't understand their culture. It could be anything like that.
Yeah.
Plus you have the issue of personality. I mean, if somebody is an introvert, they're not going to be spilling what's going on either. I have a friend, a dear friend, who keeps so much information to herself, and I've known her for 30 years, and she would rather ask questions and find out about other people. But I mean, that's a personality issue as well, I think.
I think there's a lot of cultural stuff there too, though. I worked at the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta, and there was a Black woman in the office who was a little bit older than we were, the rest of us. And when she had a doctor's appointment, she would leave to go home 2 or 3 hours before her doctor's appointment because she had to go home and take a bath and shower and clean up to go to the doctor. And I thought, you showered this morning or last night. Why do you have to do that? And then I realized it was probably because her doctor was white. And she didn't want to go in there and be thought dirty. And I was just, it stopped me cold. Fortunately, I never asked her why she had to go home that early, but you know, she would say, I have to go home and wash up before I go to the doctor.
My daughter, Christina, well, she's almost 60. I can't believe I have children that are 60. But so this story was 40 years old or more. But she had many, my kids all had Black friends at Oak Ridge High School, acquaintances. I mean, we didn't have them over all the time, and my kids didn't go to their houses, but they had lunch with them at school, and they were in clubs with them, and so forth and so on. And we've had some really wonderful Black families in Oak Ridge, and one of them were the Washingtons. Very, very fine people. And Christina became very good friends, I think, on student council with Charles Washington, who was the senior class president at Oak Ridge High School. And when the time came for the senior prom, Charles asked Christina if she would go with him to the prom. She was a junior, and there was no romance going on or anything. They were just friends. And evidently he didn't have a girlfriend, and Christina didn't have a boyfriend at the time. So Christina came home and said, Mom, Charles has asked me to go to the senior prom with him. And I thought, okay, this is a test. I had no objection to it, but right off I knew that some people would have an objection to it. And so George and I had a long talk about it, and we said, okay, if she wants to go, fine. And Charles arrived all dressed up beautifully with the corsage and everything, and Christina was dressed up beautifully, and they went and they had their pictures taken, and they had a good time, and everything was fine. And then the phone started ringing. And I heard from some of my friends, do you think that was a good idea? You know, what was this going to do to Christina's reputation? Blah, blah, blah. Well, it didn't hurt Christina's reputation. She was one of the senior class speakers and straight A student and what have you. But I know that at that particular time, now we're thinking 40 years ago, so this was a time when there was a lot of going on with Black people, and wasn't Black power exactly, but it was, you know, civil rights. There was a lot of civil rights things going on. And people knew that they should be nice about it, but some of them just couldn't. By the way, if any of you know Charles Washington, he just lost his 29-year-old son to COVID this last week. And Christina said, Mom, find his address. I've got to write him.
He's having a hard time, Judy. So if you know him, it'd be nice if you could contact him.
Yeah, well, we did. We have, yeah.
Good.
Last April, Liz and I were in Greenville, South Carolina, and we were down on the riverfront about 5 or 6 p.m. on Saturday night. And it happened to be the time when there were a lot of high school proms. And so the area around the Riverwalk, which is a beautiful area of Greenville, was just thick with young people, with high school kids dressed up in their finery. And I think we were both struck at how many interracial couples there were. Black and white young people having a great time. Some of them with mixed groups of black and white young people. And I think we both just thought, wow, Greenville, South Carolina And we both found it very hopeful, you know, that maybe there is change going on in that age group. Maybe there is an opening and a tolerance and an acceptance that perhaps was not there when we were that age.
Yeah, I've noticed that too, just observing.
My friend from college is, he's an Anglican priest, African-American, and he is, I won't say his name since we're on recording here, but I can share a little bit of his story. He, in college, started dating a white woman, a white girl, and they got very serious, ultimately got married. And her family, I don't believe, was too happy when the relationship first began, but I think they've become accepting. What I find very interesting is he has become a fairly big writer on behalf of giving voice to the African-American church and asking white church to listen to the voice of African Americans when it comes to biblical interpretation. In fact, one of my goals is ultimately, whenever we can get through COVID, is to invite him to come and do a weekend with us at St. Stephen's and sharing also with Greater Oak Ridge, and he has expressed interest in that when the time's right. But my point is he has gotten a lot of criticism from folks for writing about issues regarding race and interpretation based on skin color and culture. What I find interesting is he will often have people who are say, "Thank you for your voice, your brave voice. We are delighted you're speaking on this." And he doesn't share this because he knows the reaction he will receive in some quarters. He has had a couple of instances where people, both white and black, have found out that he's married to a white woman, and instantly there's a 180 change in how they view him. And I can't repeat some of the things that have been said about him on some online forums that I've seen, but some of the language that was alluded to in that chapter about Walter McMillan and the anger that was spurred by the idea of a black man and a white woman being together, alive and well in 2020, coming from all parts of the country too. And I'm like you, Steve, I see great progress in that front, but there's a lot of just that culture of this is horribly wrong, and the justification or just the illusion of it to lynch someone. It still seems that that's with us, unfortunately.
There are some wonderful podcasts on NPR. Code Switch, I highly recommend. You can look, online and see the different ones, but they've been doing a lot on various racial issues. And the one I've been listening to right now is about somebody looking up, trying to find the genealogy about some of her great-great-grandfather and exploring a lot of the issues with miscegenation and whatnot. It's fascinating, and I think it kind of gives you a bigger picture of how all of these rules sort of developed over the years.
All you have to do is look at the names in families, and they're the same names of the slave owners. It was all just very casually done. The master could do whatever he wanted.
There's very few, if you ever watch that wonderful program that Henry Louis Gates does, where he goes back and helps people with their genealogy, and he does African Americans, and he does, white folks and Europeans, and it's wonderful. He said that there was very, very few, small percentage of African Americans now who do not have some European DNA in them. And my brother that I was talking about, the one, again, he's we've always been very vocal about our differences politically. And he's a good man, but again, he thinks a lot of the traditional perspective. But he had said that race mixing is a bad idea. It is always going to lead to disaster. And I said, well, that particular horse has already left the barn, so to speak.
Yeah.
And there's very few African Americans,
And you're safe.
Black Americans who do not have European DNA. And I said it wasn't voluntary. It's not like they went out there and says, for a date or something.
Yeah.
But the point is that's already left, they've already had the race mixing. It's just ridiculous.
One of the things that I've enjoyed and has amused me about that program, which I watch all the time, is how many people found out that their families own slaves.
Yeah.
My family would never have had slaves. Well, of course they did. They go back far enough, they're going to find somebody with slaves. And of course, they also found how many, there was a lot of race mixing in that. One of my favorites was when he did a bunch of kids at a black school. And these kids were Black Power kids. They were Black Lives Matter and rule and so forth. And when they did their DNA, many of them were more than half white.
Yeah.
And you should have seen their faces when they got the news, because they were so proud of being Black, and or they thought they were at least. And so it was an interesting situation when they found out what they really were, and which was a little bit of everything. And I think in that case, these were Black people that were prejudiced against white people, and suddenly they realized, hey, I'm really white.
Or vice versa.
Also knew that they had been in a position without power. And I'm sure they were doubly distressed from then on.
The first year I taught at Lake City, there was a dark complected young man in the 8th grade with very curly hair, and he was biracial. His mother was white, his father was African American. By the time it came time to register him for school, his father was no longer in the picture. So there's a good chance this child is more than 50% European descent. And his mother, back at that time, the only 2 boxes she could check for him were Black or white. And she said he was white, so he was white. And he was having some real identity issues, but he was also in the 8th grade, so I think it also comes with the territory. I hope he turned out all right. He was a good kid.
I think that's maybe a reminder that I think this is a social construct. It's how you view yourself. Some people who are very light-skinned may identify as African American or as Black, and perhaps the other is true as well. But it's not.
There's a book
Not cemented into our DNA.
A book came out recently about twin females, and one chose to be white and the other one didn't, and how they encounter each other in later life. And I've been wanting to read it. I haven't gotten to it, but I thought it would be very interesting.
What I find kind of disturbing / interesting about the miscegenation laws, during slavery, the white men could have free access to Black women, but when white women would go out with Black men, all of a sudden this is terrible. So there's definitely a double standard that's been operating there for many years.
Well,
But the laws, and I was really surprised when I read this book, that how many states had these laws that there should not been not only Black-white marriage, but not even Black-white sex. And how long those laws were on the books, clear into after 2000. And how many states the judges upheld these laws. So whatever was going on, either way, was illegal. But I don't think
the Code Switch podcast.
Nobody ever got put in jail for having a Black girlfriend, but they sure did if they had a white girlfriend.
Apparently in New Orleans,
Yeah.
the laws about miscegenation were reversed for a period of 30 years. And that was the period in which the great-grandfather of the woman who was looking at her history had married. He was white and he had married a black woman. So apparently in New Orleans, there was a period of 30 years where it was okay. And then they changed it again.
Well, the New Orleans had that whole tradition of the French, you know, being basically a Spanish and then French city. And they had a whole different outlook on that. Maybe not a whole different, but a different outlook than the Americans did when they came in. And I don't know if y'all have ever read a series of mystery books by Barbara Hamley, which is based on, in the 1930s or 40s, a young black man who's a doctor who solves crimes and so forth, but is based on real New Orleans stories and real New Orleans characters. And when I went down there, I really enjoyed recreating, going to the same scenes and the same places that the books mention. So it's very well researched. But he talks a whole lot about the culture with the quadroons and, that whole thing about, the people that are, all the little gradations and so forth. And that was very much a part of a white and black culture in the United States for a long time, based on, how dark you were and then how light you were, And that was even very evident with Michelle Obama, where people were saying that her hair was straight, it was too white, So anyway.
And Edie, you have the problem where white people are really the elite. The whiter people are the elite. It keeps happening over and over.
My father was not considered white when he was growing up.
Why not?
He was Italian.
Oh, Italian, yeah.
His
So how
mother
did that
was
affect him?
redheaded.
How did that?
It meant he went to dental school instead of medical school because there was a war coming. And they told him that he would have to apply to medical school and he'd probably get drafted and sent to Europe with a gun in his hands and while he was waiting to hear. But if he wanted to go to dental school, he could go right away.
Good for him.
Well, the city of New York paid for his entire education too. So there were advantages. He had Lionel Trilling for an English teacher. Think about that one for a while.
Wow.
Before he recanted.
Yeah.
Well, friends, we're winding close to the end of our time here. I want to close with this, and this is at the end of chapter 2. You recall he's giving a speech at a little small church, Bryan Stevenson is, that is, and he was up there talking about his experience working with the death penalty. Says he shared a little bit of the experience of his encounter with the police officer in Atlanta and started to get emotional. You remember it was that elderly man in a wheelchair who waited for him at the end. And I'm just going to read from it. This is page 46 in the version that I have at the very end of chapter 2. The man cut me off and said loudly, "I'll tell you what you're doing. You're beating the drum for justice." Goes on and says, "You see the scar at the top of my head? It's where I got this trying to register to vote in Greene County, Alabama, 1964. This scar on the side, I got that in Mississippi. You see this bruise here? I got that in Birmingham." And he says, "They think these are my scars, cuts, and bruises." Stevenson says, "For the first time, I noticed that his eyes were wet with tears. He placed his hands on his head. These aren't my scars, cuts, and bruises. These are my medals of honor." And I think perhaps one of the places I am so out of touch with the experience of African Americans, particularly those who grew up in the civil rights period, is the fact that in order to have any freedom came at a great cost. You didn't lose your life, you carried symbols of that struggle on you as physical scars and certainly emotional and spiritual scars that came with it. And as we go into the next chapters, and by the way, before I forget, the next chapters that we'll do for next time are chapters 3 and 4. So that's your homework assignment. But as we go into those next chapters, you're banging the drum for justice. Funny, that's what we're supposed to do as Episcopalians. It's a huge part of our baptismal covenant is the dignity of every human being. We strive for peace and justice among all human beings. A couple of people, including one of you, whose email I just got today, and I haven't responded to it, made the comment that some of y'all are following my Acts Bible study. And there's some amazing parallels. They're very different stories, obviously, but there's some amazing parallels between what those early apostles went through and what those who have forged through the civil rights movement have gone through. Speaking what is truth, speaking what is liberating, speaking what is freeing for people who are oppressed, and the cost that comes with that. Ultimately, as I said, I always want to remind you as we finish these discussions, as we look at the specifics, bring it out to the 30,000 foot view, in that what we're called to be doing is to strive for that same peace and justice, recognizing that we're doing it in a very broken system and a very broken world. And exhibit A of that, and I'm not going to share the message, but I'm assuming that other people are watching these videos when they're recorded. We got a very nasty, racist-filled message on our St. Stephen's Facebook page that telling us that we were a bunch of lovers of word I'm not going to say here on the internet. I'm like, really? Just us having this conversation provoke that kind of a response? And so while we cannot even begin to imagine those scars and bruises that those who have had to suffer because of the color of their skin, know that just even having conversation about this can sometimes bring the worst out in people who don't want to hear anything about this, who are so set in narratives that we're trying to unwind and to tell in a much different way. And so as we talk about this, please note that the narrative of God's redemption and work to bring all people to freedom is very much being told as we're having these conversations. So I appreciate all that you're sharing in our forums here. Just continue to pray that we may all continue to learn how to listen to each other. And then when the time is right, whenever that is, be a long time from now, but whenever that time is right, that we take the opportunity to truly listen to our friends who are African American, whether that's church or whether that's individuals talking to people we already know, like you were talking about earlier, Deb, and just find a way for us to eventually to build those relationships and simply to listen to the stories and listen to their badges of honor and the scars that they've taken from the fact that the color of their skin has defined a role that is not what God intended. That's how I will finish us for today. Thank you for joining, and thank you for those of you watching on the recording for listening in, and please tune in next week if you've got Zoom, and look forward to seeing everybody then. Thank you all again very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good book.
Good night, everyone.